In a room filled with golden pastries worth more than her weekly wages, Alice Daniels asked for what everyone else considered garbage, and the man who heard her would never be the same. The late afternoon sun struck the glass facade of the Golden Crust Patisserie like a spotlight on wealth itself, turning every eclair into a work of art and every croissant into a small fortune. The air inside was thick with vanilla bean and imported butter, scents that whispered of privilege, of Sunday brunts and celebration cakes, of a world where food was pleasure, not survival. But standing at the entrance, silhouetted against all that gleaming abundance, was a woman who knew food only as fuel, and lately, as something increasingly out of reach. Alice Daniels stepped inside, her janitor's uniform faded to a ghostly gray, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and knees from 1,000 floors scrubbed, 1,000 trash bins emptied. Beside her, small hand gripped tightly in hers, stood 6-year-old Tamara. All wide eyes and hollow cheeks, her Disney princess backpack patched with duct tape. They moved together like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to each other because they were all each other had. Alice's fingers trembled slightly as she held her daughter's hand, knowing that Tamara hadn't complained once about being hungry today, which somehow made it worse. If you believe dignity can survive poverty, if you believe one moment can crack open a frozen heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us tell stories that remind us what it means to be human. Inside the patisserie, everything felt impossibly distant to Alice. The marble countertops, the brass fixtures, the pyramids of macarons arranged like precious gems. She kept her eyes lowered, knowing the weight of judgment that could come from staff in pristine white aprons who spent their days surrounded by abundance. Tamara pressed closer to her mother's leg, sensing the tension in her grip. Alice's worn sneakers squeaked softly against the spotless floor as she approached the counter, each step feeling like an intrusion into a space that wasn't meant for people like her. The young staff members looked up from their closing duties, their professional smiles flickering with uncertainty. Alice swallowed hard, her voice barely rising above the hum of the refrigeration units. "Excuse me," she said, the words catching in her throat. "I know you're about to close. I was wondering if you have any leftovers from today, the pastries you'd be throwing away anyway? I could take them home. For my daughter." But Alice didn't know that in the corner booth, partially hidden behind a marble pillar and a financial newspaper, sat a man who had spent 3 decades running from the memory of a question just like hers. Leroy Padron, billionaire developer, ruthless negotiator, the man Forbes called the Steel King, sat frozen with a cooling espresso, his sharp gray eyes suddenly fixed on the janitor and her daughter. He wore a suit that cost more than Alice made in 6 months, but in that moment, all he could see was his own mother's face 30 years ago, asking a grocer for bruised fruit in a voice filled with the same desperate dignity. To understand why Leroy Padron's hand began to shake as he set down his coffee cup, why his breath caught in his throat as if he'd been punched, you need to understand the boy he used to be, the boy he'd spent billions trying to forget. You don't have to like this story, you don't have to comment, and you definitely don't have to subscribe. But if you're still here because something about this moment feels familiar, because you know how close dignity can sit next to hunger, then this channel exists for people like you. Leroy Padron had perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. In the corner booth of the Golden Crust Patisserie, he sat like a statue carved from expensive stone. His white hair swept back in a style that had graced 3 Forbes covers. His navy suit fitted so precisely it might as well have been armor. The espresso in front of him cost $12. More than Alice Daniels made in an hour of scrubbing floors, but he hadn't tasted it in the last 20 minutes. His eyes were fixed on a quarterly financial report, numbers bleeding into numbers, profit margins and acquisition targets dancing across the page in a language only men like him could fluently speak. To the staff, he was just another wealthy customer, perhaps a lawyer or a consultant, someone who belonged in spaces like this. They had no idea they were serving a man who could buy their building with a phone call. But something was about to shatter his carefully constructed invisibility. The word drifted across the patisserie like a ghost searching for somewhere to haunt. Leftovers. Alice had said it so quietly, with such careful shame, that most people wouldn't have caught it over the espresso machine's hiss. But Leroy heard it. His hand, lifting the cup to his lips, froze midair. The porcelain trembled slightly, the dark liquid inside creating tiny ripples that spread outward like shock waves. His jaw tightened. His breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat, trapped there like something drowning. The sounds of the bakery, the gentle jazz from hidden speakers, the murmur of the refrigeration units, the rustle of the staff's movements. All of it began to fade, as if someone was slowly turning down the volume on the world itself. Leftovers. The word wasn't just a word anymore. It was a key turning in a lock he'd welded shut 30 years ago. It was a crowbar prying open a vault he'd filled with concrete and buried under skyscrapers. Leroy's vision blurred slightly at the edges, and suddenly he wasn't in the Golden Crust Patisserie anymore. He was 8 years old, standing in an alley that smelled of rotting vegetables and broken dreams, watching his mother's shoulders shake as she asked a question no parent should ever have to ask. He blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present, but his hand still hadn't moved. The espresso cup remained suspended in the air, a monument to the moment everything changed. He could see Alice at the counter now, really see her for the first time. The way she held her daughter's hand like it was the only solid thing left in a world made of quicksand. The way her uniform hung on her frame, washed so many times the gray had faded to the color of surrender. The way she kept her eyes down, as if looking up might reveal how close she was to breaking. And beside her, the little girl, Tamara, wide eyes and a thin face, a Disney backpack held together with tape, the kind of quiet that children learn when they understand their parents are fighting battles they can't help with. Leroy felt something crack inside his chest, like ice splitting under pressure, because he knew that little girl. He had been that little girl. The manager was approaching the counter now, and Leroy could see it in his posture. The slight puffing of his chest, the practiced sneer of someone who had learned to weaponize small amounts of power. The Steel King's fingers tightened around the cup handle, and for the first time in a decade, Leroy Padron felt something other than the cold satisfaction of closing a deal. He felt rage, but beneath the rage, swimming up from depths he thought he'd drowned, was something even more dangerous. He felt human again. The manager opened his mouth to speak, and Leroy knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent his entire adult life predicting human behavior, exactly what was about to happen. And as he slowly, deliberately, set his espresso cup back on the table, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding at the counter, one thought crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. Not this time. Not today. Not while I'm breathing. The question was no longer whether he would intervene. The question was how much of the old Leroy, the hungry, desperate boy from the alley, he was willing to let back into the light. The memory hit Leroy like a freight train he never saw coming, and suddenly the Golden Crust Patisserie dissolved into rain-slicked concrete and the sharp smell of garbage fermenting in summer heat. He was 8 years old again, and the world was a place where hunger had a physical weight, where his stomach didn't just feel empty but actively painful, like something inside him was folding in on itself, collapsing like a building with no foundation. His mother's hand gripped his shoulder too tightly, her fingers digging in through his thin jacket, and he knew without looking up that she was crying. Not the loud kind of crying, the silent kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that meant they'd run out of options. They stood in an alley behind Morrison's Market, where the dumpsters overflowed with produce deemed too damaged to sell but not damaged enough to be worthless. Young Leroy could see them through the chain-link fence. Bruised apples, wilted lettuce, bread with corners of mold that could be torn off. His mouth watered despite the shame burning in his chest. His mother squeezed his shoulder once more, a silent message. Stay here. Be invisible. Then she walked toward the back door of the market, her shoulders squared in a desperate imitation of dignity. Mr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on an apron stained with the juice of better days. He was a thick man with small eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they landed on, and when they landed on Leroy's mother, they found her wanting. Young Leroy watched as his mother's hands twisted together, watched as she forced words past the tightness in her throat. The rain had started, cold droplets that felt like tiny accusations against his skin, and he could see his mother getting wet, her hair plastering to her forehead, but she didn't move. She just stood there, asking in a voice that cracked at the edges if there were any bruised apples they could have. Just the ones he'd be throwing away anyway. Just enough to feed her boy. Mr. Morrison's laugh was a short, ugly bark. Leroy heard the words charity case and maybe if you'd made better choices and should have thought of that before, each phrase landing like a slap. His mother's shoulders drew inward, her spine curving as if she could make herself small enough to disappear. But what destroyed young Leroy, what carved itself into his soul with such violence that he would spend the next 3 decades trying to bury it, was what happened next. Mr. Morrison pointed to the dumpster. "You want scraps?" he said. "That's where scraps go. Help yourself. The health department won't know." His mother had walked to that dumpster. Leroy watched her climb partially inside, watched her emerge with 2 bruised apples and a half loaf of bread in a bag that had split open, and the shame on her face was so profound that young Leroy made a promise right there in that rain-soaked alley. He promised that he would never be hungry again. He promised that he would become so rich, so powerful, so untouchable that no one would ever look at him the way Mr. Morrison had looked at his mother, like she was less than human, like her hunger was a moral failing rather than a circumstance. And Leroy had kept that promise. He'd clawed his way out of poverty with a ferocity that terrified his competitors. He'd learned to bury his compassion because compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd become the Steel King, a man so cold that business magazines wrote profiles trying to figure out if he was even capable of emotion. He'd built an empire on the foundation of that 8-year-old boy's rage, and he'd convinced himself that he'd won, that he'd escaped. But now, standing in the Golden Crust Patisserie with the ghost of that alley clinging to his expensive suit, Leroy understood the truth with devastating clarity. He hadn't escaped at all. He'd just been running. And Alice Daniels, standing at that counter in her faded uniform with her daughter's hand in hers, asking for leftovers in the same desperate voice his mother had used. Alice was the mirror he'd spent 30 years refusing to look into. She wasn't just a janitor asking for scraps. She was every version of his mother he'd failed to save. She was the living ghost of everything he'd tried to forget. And this time, he had the power to rewrite the ending. The young man behind the counter, maybe 23, with the kind of soft hands that had never known real labor, exchanged a glance with the woman beside him. She wore a yellow shirt with the bakery's logo embroidered over her heart, and something flickered across her face that might have been sympathy, or might have been just the discomfort of watching someone else's humiliation. The young man opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish drowning in air. He didn't know what to say. The training manual didn't cover this. There was no corporate policy for dignity. But Marcus Finch, the manager, had no such hesitation. He emerged from the kitchen like a shark that had smelled blood in the water, his crisp white shirt buttoned to the collar, his name tag polished to a mirror shine. Marcus Finch had worked his way up from assistant to manager over 6 years, and in that time he'd developed a philosophy. The Golden Crust Patisserie wasn't just a bakery. It was a brand, an experience, a promise of exclusivity. And exclusivity meant keeping certain elements out. He'd removed loiterers. He'd banned teenagers who lingered too long. He'd cultivated an atmosphere where only the right sort of people felt welcome. And Alice Daniels, in her stained uniform with her hollow-eyed child, was decidedly not the right sort of people. Marcus approached the counter with measured steps, his smile the professional kind that never reached his eyes. The young staff members seemed to shrink back, relieved that someone with authority was handling the situation. Alice looked up, and in that moment, something in her posture shifted. hope mixing with dread, like someone waiting for a verdict they already knew would go against them. Tamara pressed closer to her mother's leg, small fingers gripping the worn fabric of Alice's pants. "I'm afraid I couldn't help but overhear your request," Marcus said, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone who'd practiced customer service but never meant it. He let the word request hang in the air for a moment, giving it just enough emphasis to make it sound like something distasteful. "And I'm afraid we have strict policies about our products. The Golden Crust Patisserie maintains the highest standards of quality and service. We don't operate a charity service, and we certainly don't distribute day-old goods. Health codes, you understand." Alice's face flushed, color spreading across her cheeks like a stain. I just thought, since you'd be throwing them away anyway." "The trash," Marcus interrupted smoothly, his smile sharpening into something cruel, "is in the back. If you'd like to check the dumpster, you're welcome to do so, though I can't vouch for what the health department would say about that choice." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching Alice's expression crumble. "I'd suggest you consider shopping at establishments more suited to your budget. Perhaps the discount grocer on 5th? I hear they have a clearance section." The young woman in the yellow shirt, her name tag read Jessica, flinched visibly. The young man suddenly found the register very interesting, his eyes fixed on the screen as if it held the secrets of the universe. Neither of them said a word. Silence, Leroy had learned long ago, was just another form of consent. Alice's hand tightened around Tamara's fingers, and for a moment, Leroy thought she might run. Her body was already turning toward the door, her survival instinct screaming at her to escape before the humiliation became unbearable. But then Tamara looked up at her mother with those wide, trusting eyes, and Alice froze. Because running meant going home to an empty refrigerator. Running meant watching her daughter go to bed hungry for the 3rd night this week. Running meant failing the one person who depended on her to be strong. So Alice stood there, trapped between dignity and desperation, her shoulders trembling with the effort of not breaking down completely. And Marcus Finch, seeing his victory secured, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He'd protected the brand. He'd maintained standards. He'd done his job. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that in the corner booth, a billionaire had just made a decision that would cost Marcus everything he'd spent 6 years building. The Steel King was done watching. The sound of ceramic hitting marble was like a gunshot in a library. One moment, the Golden Crust Patisserie was filled with the ambient hum of civilized commerce, the whisper of the espresso machine, the soft jazz bleeding from hidden speakers, the rustle of tissue paper being folded around pastries. The next moment, all of that disappeared, swallowed by the sharp crack of Leroy Padron's cup hitting the floor and exploding into a dozen pieces. The espresso spread across the white marble like blood at a crime scene, dark and accusatory. Every head in the bakery turned toward the corner booth. Marcus Finch's smile evaporated mid-sneer. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth. The young man behind the counter went pale. Even Alice, caught in her moment of private devastation, looked up with startled eyes. And then Leroy stood up. It was a simple movement, a man rising from a chair, but somehow it felt seismic, tectonic, like watching a mountain decide to walk. Leroy Padron was 6'2", but in that moment, he seemed to fill the entire room, his presence expanding to occupy every corner, every shadow, every pocket of air. His white hair caught the late afternoon light. His navy suit, tailored to perfection, made him look like he'd stepped out of a boardroom on Wall Street. But it was his eyes, cold gray eyes that had stared down CEOs and senators and billionaires who thought they were untouchable, that transformed the atmosphere from uncomfortable to genuinely terrifying. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The Steel King had learned decades ago that silence was the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. Let them sweat. Let them wonder. Let them imagine the worst thing that could happen, and then realize that whatever they'd imagined wasn't nearly bad enough. Leroy walked toward the counter with measured steps, his Italian leather shoes crunching over fragments of his shattered cup. Each footfall echoed in the silence like a countdown. Marcus Finch's face cycled through a rapid sequence of emotions. Confusion, recognition, horror, because everyone in the city knew who Leroy Padron was. The Steel King, the man who'd bought 3 blocks of downtown real estate during the last recession. The billionaire who'd demolished a historic theater just because he didn't like the architecture. The developer whose name appeared in the business section of the newspaper at least once a month, usually accompanied by words like ruthless and unyielding and unstoppable. And Marcus had just mocked a woman in front of him. "Mr. Padron," Marcus started, his voice climbing an octave, his professional composure shattering faster than the coffee cup had. "Sir, I didn't realize you were. I'm so sorry for the disturbance. I'll have this situation handled immediately. If you'll just give me a moment." Quiet. The word wasn't loud. Leroy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The single syllable carried the weight of avalanches, the finality of a judge's gavel, the cold certainty of a man who'd never learned to repeat himself. Marcus's mouth snapped shut so fast his teeth clicked together. Leroy walked past the manager without looking at him, as if Marcus Finch had suddenly become invisible, as if his entire existence was now so irrelevant that acknowledging it would be a waste of energy. He moved past the trembling staff members, past the counter with its pristine glass display cases, and stopped directly in front of Alice Daniels. Alice flinched, her body instinctively preparing for another blow. Her arms came up slightly, as if to shield Tamara, as if this powerful man in his expensive suit was just another person who'd come to tell her she didn't belong, that her poverty was a character flaw, that her hunger was her own fault. She looked up at him with eyes that had learned to expect cruelty, and Leroy felt that crack in his chest widen further, felt 30 years of carefully constructed ice beginning to split apart. He looked at the display case beside them, the cakes decorated like jewels, the croissants dusted with edible gold, the eclairs lined up like soldiers made of chocolate and cream. Each item probably cost more than Alice made in a shift. He could buy every pastry in this place without checking his bank balance. He could buy the building without breaking stride. He had spent 3 decades accumulating the kind of wealth that made these decisions meaningless. And in that moment, Leroy Padron decided to make it mean something. He turned to look at Marcus Finch, and his voice, when it came, was quiet and absolutely lethal. "Pack everything." Marcus blinked. "Sir, everything in this case." Leroy's hand swept across the display, indicating the entire bakery. "Every loaf, every pastry, every cake in the kitchen, every meal you have prepared. Pack it into the finest boxes you have." He paused, his gray eyes locking onto Marcus with the precision of a laser sight. "And if I see one item handled with anything less than the utmost care, if I see one careless movement, one moment of disrespect, you'll find yourself looking for a job before the sun goes down. Do I make myself clear?" The transformation was instant and absolute. Marcus and the staff exploded into frantic movement, scrambling like their lives depended on it, which in a very real sense they did. What would happen next would depend entirely on how well they followed orders. The bakery erupted into controlled chaos. Marcus barked orders with a voice that had lost all its smugness, replaced by the sharp edge of panic. Jessica and the young man, his name tag read David, moved like their feet were on fire, pulling out the bakery's most expensive boxes, the ones reserved for wedding cakes and corporate orders, the ones lined with gold tissue paper and tied with silk ribbons. David's hands shook as he lifted a chocolate torte from the display case, his face pale with the knowledge that his job hung by a thread thinner than the sugar work decorating the pastry. Marcus himself had abandoned all pretense of managerial dignity. He rushed into the kitchen, shouting for the bakers to box everything. The fresh loaves cooling on racks, the croissants set aside for tomorrow's opening, even the experimental tarts the head baker had been perfecting. The sound of rustling paper and sliding boxes filled the air, punctuated by whispered curses and the occasional clatter of someone moving too fast. But Leroy Padron wasn't watching the staff. He was watching Alice. She stood frozen, her daughter pressed against her side, her eyes wide with an expression that moved through confusion and disbelief before landing somewhere near terror. She didn't understand what was happening. She'd come here expecting crumbs, expecting rejection, expecting at best some stale bread wrapped in a napkin if the staff took pity on her. Instead, she was witnessing what looked like a military operation executed in her honor, and she didn't know whether to run or stay, whether this was kindness or some elaborate joke that would end with even greater humiliation. "I don't," Alice started, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't pay for." Leroy held up one hand, gentle but firm, and Alice's words died in her throat. For the first time since he'd stood up, Leroy's expression softened. Not much. The Steel King wasn't capable of much. But something in his eyes shifted, some of the permafrost melting just enough to reveal the human being underneath. "You're not paying," he said quietly. "You asked for leftovers. You asked for what would be thrown away. I'm simply ensuring that nothing goes to waste." It was a lie, of course. A beautiful, necessary lie. Nothing in this bakery would have been thrown away. The staff would have taken it home or donated it or found some use for it. But Leroy understood something that Marcus Finch never would. That charity without dignity was just another form of cruelty. So he gave Alice the fiction she needed, the story that let her accept help without feeling like she was accepting defeat. Jessica approached carrying 3 boxes already filled and tied, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been fighting tears. She set them on the counter with a gentleness that spoke of genuine care. And when she glanced at Alice, her expression was one of apology so profound it might as well have been prayer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words meant only for Alice. I'm sorry." Alice nodded, unable to speak, her throat too tight with emotions she couldn't name. But Leroy wasn't done. He moved, slowly and deliberately, lowering himself until he was at Tamara's height. The little girl stared at him with those enormous eyes that had seen too much hardship for someone who should still believe in fairy tales. Leroy reached into one of the boxes Jessica had packed and pulled out a strawberry tart. The kind with fresh berries glazed to shine like rubies, with cream so white it looked like snow. The kind of dessert that belonged in photographs rather than in the hands of a 6-year-old in a taped-together backpack. He held it out to her, not with pity, but with respect, as if she were a business partner, as if she were his equal, as if her hunger was not a shameful secret but simply a problem that deserved to be solved. "This one's for right now," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "The rest are for later, but I think you've waited long enough for something sweet, don't you?" Tamara looked at her mother, seeking permission. Alice nodded, tears streaming down her face now, no longer bothering to hide them. The little girl took the tart with both hands, holding it like it was made of glass, and when she took her first bite, her eyes closed with an expression of pure joy so profound that it hurt to witness. It was the look of a child tasting not just strawberries and cream, but hope itself. Leroy stayed there, kneeling on the expensive marble floor in his $1,000 suit, and watched her eat. He didn't look away. He didn't rush her. He gave her the gift of his complete attention, the acknowledgement that she mattered, that her happiness was worth a billionaire's time. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the Golden Crust Patisserie. The air itself seemed different, lighter, as if the building had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Marcus appeared with more boxes, his forehead beaded with sweat, his hands full of packages tied with ribbon. David followed with an insulated bag containing the items that needed to stay cold. Jessica had already called for a taxi, had already paid for it with money from the register, had already written down the address Alice had stammered out when asked. The pile of boxes grew, 5, 7, 10, each one filled with food that would have fed a family of 4 for a week. Leroy stood up, his knees protesting slightly, a reminder that he was no longer the hungry boy in the alley, but a man in his 50s who spent too much time behind a desk. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crisp linen handkerchief, offering it to Alice as she struggled to compose herself. She took it with trembling hands, dabbing at her eyes, trying to find words for something that existed beyond the reach of language. "Thank you," she finally managed, the words inadequate and enormous all at once. "I don't know how to. I can't." "You already did," Leroy said simply. "You asked. That took more courage than you know." He paused, watching as Tamara finished the last bite of her tart, licking cream from her fingers with the unself-conscious delight of a child who'd briefly forgotten what worry felt like. "I heard your call, and I realized I've been holding on to the wrong things for a very long time." But even as he said it, even as the staff loaded boxes into the waiting taxi, even as Alice and Tamara prepared to leave with enough food to last them through the hardest weeks, Leroy knew this wasn't finished. Giving them food was a bandage. It would heal nothing. It would change nothing. In a week, maybe 2, Alice would be right back where she started, hungry, desperate, asking for scraps. And Leroy Padron, the Steel King, the man who'd built an empire on the principle that everything could be bought and sold, was about to do something he'd never done before. He was about to give away something that actually mattered. But first, he had a phone call to make. Leroy stepped outside onto the sidewalk as the taxi pulled away, Alice's stunned face visible through the rear window, Tamara clutching a box of pastries like treasure. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside Avenue, turning everything golden, but Leroy barely noticed. He pulled out his phone, a sleek device that probably cost more than Alice's monthly rent, and scrolled through his contacts with the practiced ease of someone who'd built an empire one call at a time. He found the name he wanted, Jennifer Park, his executive assistant, the woman who'd been with him for 12 years and had seen him at his worst and somehow stayed anyway. She answered on the first ring. "Leroy, I wasn't expecting to hear from you until Monday. I need you to acquire a property," Leroy said, his voice shifting back into the tone that had earned him his nickname. Cold, efficient, a surgical instrument made of words. "The Golden Crust Patisserie on Riverside Avenue. I want the building, the business, the name, the recipes, everything. I want the current owner contacted within the hour with an offer they won't refuse." There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of fingers flying over a keyboard. Jennifer had learned long ago not to ask why until after she'd gotten the how. The property records show it's owned by a holding company, Marcel Industries. "The principal is—" "I don't care who the principal is," Leroy interrupted. "Offer them 3 times market value. If they refuse, offer them 5. I want the paperwork on my desk by close of business Monday. And Jennifer," he paused, looking back through the window of the bakery where Marcus was visible, still frantically organizing boxes. "I want you to prepare termination papers for the current manager, Marcus Finch. I'll send you his information. Severance package of 2 weeks, standard exit interview, effective immediately." "Understood. And the business itself? Are you planning to?" "I'm planning to run it properly," Leroy said, "which means hiring people who understand that feeding human beings is not a privilege reserved for people who can afford gold leaf sugar." He could hear the surprise in Jennifer's silence, the unspoken questions. The Steel King didn't make emotional decisions. The Steel King didn't buy bakeries because someone had been cruel to a janitor. But maybe Leroy thought the Steel King had been wrong about a lot of things. "There's one more thing," he continued. "Find out who the young woman in the yellow shirt is. The one working the counter today. Jessica something. I want her promoted to manager as of Monday morning. Double her current salary and add full benefits. Medical, dental, the whole package. And start drafting a job offer for Alice Daniels. She's the woman who was here today. I want to offer her a position as building coordinator for our downtown properties. $45,000 annual, full benefits, flexible hours so she can be there when her daughter gets home from school." "Alice Daniels," Jennifer repeated, typing. And her qualifications? She survived, Leroy said flatly. That's qualification enough. He ended the call before Jennifer could ask anything else. Before he had to explain that what he was doing wasn't business, it was exorcism. He was trying to purge 30 years of ghosts with a few phone calls and a checkbook, and he knew it was inadequate, knew it was too little too late, but it was something. It was more than the 8-year-old boy in the alley had been able to do for his mother. When Leroy walked back into the Golden Crust Patisserie, the atmosphere had shifted again. Marcus stood behind the counter, his crisp white shirt now rumpled, his face still flushed from exertion. Jessica and David were cleaning up the chaos of the rapid packing, wiping down surfaces, trying to restore some semblance of order. They all looked up when Leroy entered, their expressions a mixture of hope and fear, waiting for judgment. Leroy walked to the counter with the same measured steps he'd used before, but this time there was no anger in his movement, only inevitability. He looked at Marcus, and the manager seemed to shrink under his gaze. All his earlier confidence evaporated like steam from an espresso machine. "Mr. Finch," Leroy said, his voice neutral, businesslike. "As of Monday morning, this establishment will be under new ownership. Your services will no longer be required. My assistant will be in touch with the details of your severance package." Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "But the bakery policies I was just following." "The policies," Leroy interrupted quietly, "are about to change, dramatically." He turned to Jessica, who stood frozen with a cleaning cloth in her hand, her eyes wide. "MS? Miller," she stammered. "Jessica Miller. Ms. Miller. How long have you worked here?" "3 years, sir." "And do you enjoy it?" Jessica glanced at Marcus, then back at Leroy, calculation and courage warring on her face. Finally, courage won. "I love baking, sir. I love feeding people. I don't always love what I'm asked to do." Leroy nodded, something almost like approval flickering across his face. "As of Monday, you're the new manager. My assistant will contact you this evening with the details. I expect this bakery to continue producing excellent pastries, but I also expect it to remember that food is not just business, it's survival. It's dignity. It's the difference between a child going to bed hungry and a child going to bed with a full stomach and hope for tomorrow. Do you understand?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her voice thick when she spoke. "Yes, sir. I understand completely." "Good." Leroy turned to leave, then paused, one final thought occurring to him. "And Ms. Miller? At the end of every day, whatever's left, the bread, the pastries, anything that won't keep until morning, you donate it. To shelters, to families who need it, to anyone who asks with the same courage that woman showed today." "Understood." "Yes, sir," Jessica whispered, and this time she was smiling through her tears. Leroy walked out of the Golden Crust Patisserie for the second time that afternoon, and as the door closed behind him, he heard Marcus Finch begin to argue, heard David trying to process what had just happened, heard Jessica laugh, a sound of pure, disbelieving joy. The Steel King had just turned a bakery into a charity with a single conversation, had upended lives and restructured a business because he'd overheard one word: leftovers. The word that had broken him open. The word that had reminded him that beneath all his billions and all his towers and all his carefully constructed armor, he was still that 8-year-old boy who'd promised never to let anyone suffer the way his mother had suffered. It had taken 30 years and a janitor with more courage than most CEOs, but Leroy Padron had finally kept his promise. The question now was whether he could keep going, whether he could maintain this crack in his armor, or whether by Monday morning he'd have sealed himself back up and returned to being the Steel King, cold, efficient, and utterly alone. Leroy had told them to stay. It wasn't a command exactly, more of an invitation delivered in the tone of someone who'd forgotten how to ask for things rather than demand them. "Before you go," he'd said to Alice, who'd been preparing to leave with her boxes and her taxi, Would you share a cup of tea with me? I'd like to talk, if you have time. Alice had looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language, but something in his expression, a vulnerability that seemed out of place on a billionaire's face, made her nod. So now they sat at the finest table in the Golden Crust Patisserie, the one by the window where the afternoon light turned everything soft and forgiving. Tamara sat beside her mother, working her way through a chocolate croissant with the focused intensity of a child who'd learned not to waste a single crumb. Jessica had brought them tea, expensive loose leaf, the kind served in actual china cups, before retreating to give them privacy. Leroy sat across from them, his hands wrapped around his own cup, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was full, weighted with things that needed to be said but didn't have easy words attached to them. "I'm sorry," Alice finally said, her voice small, "for the trouble, for all of this. I never meant to cause a scene. I just thought, don't apologize." Leroy's voice was firm but not harsh. "You did nothing wrong. You asked a question. That took courage. More than I've had for a very long time." Alice looked down at her tea, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. I lost my husband 2 years ago. Accident at the construction site where he worked. The insurance it wasn't enough. And daycare costs more than I make in a week, so I bring Tamara with me to work sometimes, when the building's empty. I clean offices at night, after everyone's gone home. It's not much, but it's something. It's supposed to be something. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together, fighting for composure. Leroy watched her, and something in his chest, that crack that had been widening all afternoon, split completely open. "I grew up poor," he said, the words coming out rough, unpracticed. "Worse than poor. My mother worked 3 jobs. We lived in a basement apartment that flooded every spring. And I remember..." He paused, his jaw working, decades of suppressed memory forcing its way to the surface. "I remember being 8 years old, standing in an alley behind a grocery store, watching my mother beg for bruised fruit. The grocer told her the dumpster was out back if she wanted to dig through it." Alice's eyes widened, her hand moving instinctively to cover her mouth. "I promised myself that day," Leroy continued, his voice distant, as if he were speaking from inside that memory, "that I would never be that hungry again, that I would make enough money that no one could ever make me feel small. So I did. I built an empire. I became the Steel King. And somewhere along the way, I forgot why I started. I forgot that little boy in the alley. I forgot my mother. I forgot that money was supposed to be a tool, not a fortress." He looked directly at Alice now, his gray eyes no longer cold but something else. "Haunted, maybe, or awakened. Until today. Until I heard you ask for leftovers in the exact same voice my mother used 30 years ago. And I realized I'd been so busy running from that alley that I'd become exactly like the grocer who humiliated her." "No," Alice said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "No, you're not like him. You're nothing like him." He walked away. "You didn't." Leroy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, heavy stock, embossed letters, the kind that announced importance before you even read the name. But when he slid it across the table to Alice, his hand was shaking slightly. "I'm offering you a job," he said. "Building coordinator for my downtown properties. It means you'd manage the cleaning schedules, hire the janitorial staff, make sure the buildings are maintained properly. $45,000 a year, full benefits, hours that let you be home when Tamara gets out of school." Alice stared at the card like it might bite her. I'm not qualified for that. I clean floors. I empty trash. I don't." "You survived," Leroy interrupted. "You kept your daughter fed. You asked for help even though it terrified you. That makes you more qualified than half the people I employ." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "I'm not offering you charity, Alice. I'm offering you what you deserve, what you should have had all along. a living wage, dignity, a chance to stop drowning. Tamara looked up from her croissant, chocolate smeared across her cheek, and spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "Mommy, does this mean we don't have to be hungry anymore?" The question was so simple, so devastatingly innocent, that Alice broke. She pulled her daughter close, tears streaming freely now, and nodded against Tamara's hair. "Yes, baby. Yes, it does." Leroy looked away, giving them privacy, and found himself staring out the window at Riverside Avenue. People walked past. Businessmen in suits, mothers with strollers, teenagers laughing about something on their phones. All of them moving through their lives completely unaware that inside this bakery, everything had changed. For Alice, for Tamara, for Leroy himself. "My mother died when I was 22, he said quietly, still looking out the window. "Before I'd made my first million, before I could give her any of this. She never got to see that her son escaped. She died still believing she'd failed me because she couldn't always keep food on the table." He turned back to Alice, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your call for leftovers wasn't just heard by me, Alice. It was heard by every version of my mother I couldn't save. And by answering it, by helping you, maybe I'm finally answering her too." Alice reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her calloused, work-worn hand covering his manicured one, and squeezed. "She'd be proud of you, for this, for today." Leroy didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded. They sat like that for a moment longer, two people from completely different worlds who'd found themselves connected by the universal language of hunger and hope and second chances. Then Tamara asked if she could have one more pastry, and Alice laughed. A real laugh, the kind that sounded like it had forgotten how to exist and just remembered. And Leroy realized that the warmth spreading through his chest wasn't discomfort. It was what it felt like to be human again. The sun was lower now, painting Riverside Avenue in shades of amber and rose, the kind of evening light that made everything look like it belonged in a painting. Alice and Tamara walked down the sidewalk carrying boxes that looked like they contained treasure, which, in a way, they did. Treasure wasn't always gold. Sometimes it was bread and pastries and chocolate croissants. Sometimes it was the promise of a job that paid enough to live on. Sometimes it was simply the knowledge that someone had seen you when you'd felt invisible and had decided you mattered. Tamara skipped, her thin legs bouncing with energy that came from a full stomach and a heart that had forgotten, at least for a moment, what it felt like to be afraid. Alice watched her daughter move through the world like a child should, and something in her chest loosened, a knot she'd been carrying for 2 years finally beginning to untie itself. They'd go home. They'd put the food away. They'd sleep tonight without the gnawing anxiety of wondering where tomorrow's meal would come from. And on Monday, Alice would call the number on Leroy Padron's card and begin a life she'd stopped letting herself dream about. But inside the Golden Crust Patisserie, Leroy remained. He sat at the same table, watching through the window as Alice and Tamara disappeared around the corner, and felt something he hadn't felt in decades: contentment. Not the cold satisfaction of closing a lucrative deal or the hollow triumph of crushing a competitor. This was different, warmer, more real. It was the feeling of having done something that mattered, something that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't control or predict or monetize. The financial report still sat on the table where he'd abandoned it hours ago. Leroy picked it up, scanning the numbers that had seemed so crucial this morning: projected earnings, market analysis, quarterly projections. A month ago, these numbers had been his entire world. They'd defined his worth, his success, his identity. He tracked every fluctuation like a general studying battle maps, had celebrated increases and agonized over losses, had built his entire existence around the accumulation of more. Now, looking at them in the golden light of early evening, they felt like hieroglyphics from a civilization he no longer belonged to. The numbers were still there, still real, still representing millions of dollars in value. But they meant nothing compared to the look on Tamara's face when she'd taken her first bite of that strawberry tart. They meant nothing compared to the hope in Alice's eyes when she'd accepted his business card. They meant nothing compared to the warmth currently spreading through his chest, melting ice he'd spent 30 years accumulating. Leroy set the report down and looked at his hands. Hands that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions. Hands that had built towers and demolished buildings. Hands that had been used for acquisition and expansion and the ruthless accumulation of wealth. The same hands that had offered a linen handkerchief to a crying janitor. The same hands that had held a strawberry tart out to a hungry child with genuine care. He thought about the 8-year-old boy in the rain-slicked alley, the one who'd made a promise that he would never be hungry again, that he would become so powerful that no one could ever hurt him. That boy had gotten what he wanted. Leroy Padron had billions. He had properties in 3 countries. He had a name that appeared in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He had everything that poor, scared child had dreamed of. But he'd forgotten the most important part. That boy hadn't wanted wealth for wealth's sake. He'd wanted it so his mother wouldn't have to beg grocers for bruised apples. He'd wanted it so that no one would ever have to feel as small and powerless as he'd felt in that moment. Somewhere along the way, Leroy had achieved the goal but lost the purpose. He'd built the fortress but forgotten what he was protecting, until Alice Daniels walked into a bakery and asked for leftovers. Jessica approached his table, moving carefully, as if she wasn't sure whether disturbing him was allowed. "Mr. Padron? We're closing up soon. Can I get you anything else?" Leroy looked at her, this young woman who'd shown a sliver of kindness when kindness wasn't convenient, who'd be managing this bakery come Monday morning because she understood something Marcus Finch never would. "Tell me something, Ms. Miller. Why did you look at Alice with sympathy when the others just looked uncomfortable?" Jessica fidgeted with her apron, considering the question. "My mom was a single parent. I remember times when things were tight, when we'd go to the grocery store and she'd have to put things back at the register because we didn't have enough. I remember the way people would look at us. So when I saw Alice today, I saw my mom. I saw us." She met his eyes. "I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. I'm sorry I didn't do more." "You did enough," Leroy said. "You saw her as a person. That's more than most people manage." He stood up, pulling out his wallet and extracting several $100 bills. He laid them on the table. "For the damages, the broken cup, and for whatever's left at the end of the day tomorrow. I want you to find families like Alice's and make sure they get it." Jessica stared at the money, then at him. "Mr. Padron, I don't think you understand how much food that could buy for people who need it." "I understand perfectly," Leroy said, and for the first time in years, maybe decades, he smiled. It was a small smile, rusty from disuse, but it was genuine. "I'm counting on it." He walked out of the Golden Crust Patisserie into the evening air, which felt different somehow. Warmer, maybe, or perhaps it was the same temperature it had always been, and Leroy was just feeling it for the first time in 30 years. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Leroy stood on the sidewalk watching it. Not in a hurry to get back to his penthouse apartment or his next business deal or his next acquisition. For the first time since he was 8 years old, Leroy Padron wasn't running from anything. He was just standing still, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, remembering what it was like to be human. And he realized that humanity wasn't something you lost when you got rich or gained when you were poor. It was something you chose every day, in small moments that seemed insignificant until you added them all up and realized they were the only moments that mattered. He'd spent 3 decades building an empire. Tomorrow, he'd start learning how to use it for something that actually mattered. The Steel King was melting, and what emerged from the ice wasn't weakness. It was the boy who'd once promised his mother that things would get better. And for the first time in 30 years, Leroy Padron was finally keeping that promise. Not just for himself, but for every Alice and every Tamara who stood at counters asking for leftovers, believing they deserved nothing more than scraps. They deserved everything. And maybe, just maybe, Leroy had finally figured out how to give it to them. The sun set completely, and Leroy Padron walked home through streets that felt brand new, carrying nothing but a warmth in his chest and the knowledge that sometimes the most important transactions aren't the ones that make you rich. They're the ones that make you whole. 3 months later, the morning sun hit the windows of the Padron building differently than it used to. Or maybe it was the same sun, and Leroy was just noticing it for the first time. He stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor, coffee in hand. Not the $12 espresso from artisan cafes, but the regular drip coffee from the break room that his employees drank, the kind that tasted like community instead of status. Below him, the city spread out in all directions, a maze of steel and glass and human stories, and somewhere in that maze, Alice Daniels was starting her 3rd week as building coordinator. His phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. "She's here. Conference room B. Ready when you are." Leroy smiled. That same rusty smile that was getting easier every day, and headed for the elevators. He'd called this meeting weeks ago, had spent countless hours with lawyers and accountants and advisors who'd looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Or maybe he'd finally found it. Conference room B was filled with people who didn't usually occupy spaces like this. Social workers in practical blazers, community organizers with worn notebooks, representatives from homeless shelters and food banks. And at the head of the table, looking both terrified and determined in a navy suit that Jennifer had helped her pick out, sat Alice Daniels. She stood when Leroy entered, and he waved her back down. "Please, you're the director here, not me. I'm just the checkbook." Alice's eyes widened. "Director of the Daniels Foundation," Leroy said, taking a seat beside her. "Named after you and your daughter. I've established an endowment of $50 million, with annual contributions of $5 million more. The mission is simple: to provide dignified support for working families who are one emergency away from hunger. No applications that feel like interrogations. No hoops to jump through. No shame. Just help when it's needed. The way it should have been there for you." The room erupted in murmurs. Excited, disbelieving, hopeful. Alice looked like she might faint. "Mr. Padron, I can't. I'm not qualified to run a foundation. I'm a janitor who..." "You're a mother who kept her daughter fed against impossible odds," Leroy interrupted gently. "You're a woman who had the courage to ask for help when asking felt like dying. You understand what these families need because you've lived it. That makes you more qualified than any Ivy League MBA I could hire." He slid a folder across the table to her. "Obviously, you'll have a full staff, financial officers, program directors, people who know how to navigate the legal requirements. But the heart of this foundation, the mission, the understanding of who we serve and why it matters. That's you, Alice. That's all you." Alice opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside was an organizational chart, a mission statement written in language that treated poverty as a circumstance rather than a moral failing, and a salary offer that made her gasp audibly. But it was the mission statement that made her cry, because every word felt like it had been written by someone who understood, who'd been there, who knew that hunger wasn't just about empty stomachs but about empty dignity. "We start with food security," Leroy continued, addressing the room now. "Every bakery, restaurant, and grocery store in my properties will donate end-of-day items to families who need them. But that's just the beginning. Emergency rent assistance, medical bill support, job training, childcare subsidies. Whatever stands between a working family and stability, we remove it. No bureaucracy, no judgment, just help." A woman from the 2nd Street shelter raised her hand. "Mr. Padron, this is incredible, but how do we ensure it's sustainable? That it doesn't become another charity that makes promises and then disappears when funding gets tight?" "The endowment is irrevocable," Leroy said. "Legally protected. Even if I wanted to take the money back, which I couldn't. This foundation will exist long after I'm gone. It's not a vanity project. It's a promise." He paused, his voice dropping. 30 years ago, my mother begged for bruised apples in an alley. Nobody helped her. She died believing she'd failed me. This foundation is my way of helping every mother like her, every child like I was. It's how I keep the promise I made to a woman who never got to see me keep it. The room went quiet. Someone sniffled. Alice reached over and squeezed Leroy's hand, the same gesture she'd made in the bakery 3 months ago, and he squeezed back. But Leroy wasn't finished. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker. There's one more thing. I've been reviewing my properties, all 43 buildings I own in this city, and I've realized something. The people who clean these buildings, who maintain them, who keep them running, they're invisible. They work nights so they don't disturb the day workers. They use service elevators so they don't make the executives uncomfortable. They're essential, but we treat them like they're expendable. He opened the folder, revealing page after page of employee names and numbers. Effective immediately, every janitor, maintenance worker, and service employee in my buildings is getting a 40% raise. Full benefits, paid sick leave, retirement contributions, and profit sharing, because they're not just workers, they're stakeholders in these buildings' success. A man from the Workers' Alliance actually stood up. Mr. Padron, do you understand what you're saying? That's going to cost you millions annually. You're shareholders. I am the majority shareholder, Leroy said flatly, and I've decided that a building that can't afford to pay its workers a living wage is a building I don't want to own. If my profit margins shrink, they shrink. I'll survive. The question is whether my employees can survive on what I've been paying them, and the answer has been no. So we're fixing it. The meeting continued for another hour, logistics and timelines and program details, but Leroy found his attention drifting to the window. Down below, people moved through the city like blood cells through a body, each one carrying their own struggles and hopes and stories. How many of them were one emergency away from disaster? How many were choosing between medicine and groceries, between rent and heating, between dignity and survival? He couldn't save them all, but he could save some. And maybe, if he was lucky, his example would inspire others with wealth and power to remember that money was just a tool, and the question wasn't how much you accumulated but what you built with it. After the meeting ended and the attendees filed out, buzzing with excitement and possibility, Alice remained. She looked at Leroy with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with something else. Concern, maybe. Are you okay? She asked. It's a lot. You're changing your entire business model, creating a foundation, putting my name on things. People are going to ask questions. They're going to wonder why the Steel King suddenly grew a heart. Leroy smiled. Let them wonder. The truth is, I didn't grow a heart, Alice. I just stopped pretending I didn't have one. He stood up, looking out at the city again. For 30 years, I've been trying to build walls high enough that I'd never feel small again. But walls don't just keep pain out. They keep everything out. Joy, connection, purpose. I was rich and powerful and completely alone. And now, Alice asked softly, now I'm rich and powerful and trying to figure out what that's actually worth. He turned to face her. You saved my life, Alice. You and Tamara. That day in the bakery when you asked for leftovers, you reminded me that I was human. That I'd been human all along. Just buried under so much ice I'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Alice stood and walked to stand beside him at the window. Tamara asks about you, you know. She calls you the nice man with the sad eyes. She wants to know if you're eating enough, if you're taking care of yourself. She laughed. A 6-year-old worrying about a billionaire. But I think she sees something in you that you're just starting to see in yourself. What's that? That you're not the Steel King, Alice said. You're just Leroy. And Leroy is a good man who forgot that for a while but is remembering now. She paused. She made you something, by the way. Tamara. A drawing. She wanted me to give it to you. Alice pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to him. Leroy unfolded it carefully, and his breath caught. It was a crayon drawing, crude in the way children's art always is, but filled with more emotion than any painting in any gallery. It showed three figures: a tall man with white hair, a woman in a blue dress, and a small girl holding hands between them. Above them, Tamara had written in careful, uneven letters, "My family, thank you for helping us. Love, Tamara." The misspellings made it more precious somehow, more real. Leroy's vision blurred, and he realized he was crying. Not the suppressed tears of someone trying to maintain composure, but actual, honest crying. The kind that came from a place so deep he'd forgotten it existed. "She considers me family?" he managed to ask. "We both do," Alice said simply. "You gave us more than food and a job, Leroy. You gave us hope. You showed us that the world still had kindness in it. That's worth more than any foundation or salary or building." Leroy carefully folded the drawing and put it in his jacket pocket, right over his heart. "I'm having lunch with my lawyer next week," he said, his voice still thick with emotion, "to update my will. The foundation is protected, but I want to make sure Tamara's college education is fully funded. And I'd like to set up a trust for her. Nothing she can access until she's 25, but enough that she'll never have to beg for bruised apples in an alley." "Leroy, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted. "I want to, because maybe if I can give Tamara the future my mother never got to give me, maybe I can finally forgive myself for all the years I spent running from where I came from instead of helping people who were still there." They stood together at the window, watching the sun climb higher over the city, and Leroy realized that this view, the one he'd looked at for 15 years from this office, finally meant something. It wasn't just a display of power or a reminder of how far he'd climbed. It was a responsibility. Every building, every street, every person down there was part of a system he'd benefited from, and now it was time to make sure that system worked for people like Alice and Tamara too. "You know what the best part is?" Leroy said. "I thought helping you would cost me something, that I'd have to give up some of my wealth or power or success. But it didn't cost me anything. It gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" "A reason to get up in the morning," he said simply. "For 30 years, I've been building an empire, but I never knew what it was for. Now I do. It's for this. For families who need someone to see them. For children who deserve strawberry tarts and college educations and a world that doesn't punish them for their parents' circumstances. That's what all of this was supposed to be for all along." Alice smiled, and it transformed her face. The worry lines smoothed out, the exhaustion lifted, and for a moment, she looked like someone who'd been given permission to dream again. "The Daniels Foundation," she said, testing the words. "It still doesn't feel real." "It will," Leroy promised. "And when it does, when you're helping families the way I helped you, remember something. You're not saving them. You're just reminding them that they're worth saving. That their hunger doesn't define them. That one bad break doesn't mean they're broken." He paused. "That's what you did for me, Alice. You reminded me I wasn't broken, just frozen. And sometimes all it takes to melt ice is someone brave enough to ask for help." 3 months ago, Alice Daniels had walked into a bakery asking for scraps, believing she was worthless. Today, she was the director of a $50 million foundation, living in an apartment where the refrigerator was always full, watching her daughter thrive in a new school where nobody looked at her like she was less than. And Leroy Padron, the Steel King, had finally figured out what his empire was for. Not to build higher walls, but to tear them down. Not to separate himself from the world, but to connect to it. Not to forget where he came from, but to honor it by making sure fewer people had to suffer the way he and his mother had suffered. As Alice left the conference room to begin her first official day as foundation director, Leroy remained at the window. He pulled out Tamara's drawing and looked at it again. At the three figures holding hands, at the misspelled words written with so much love and hope. He'd spent 30 years trying to build a legacy out of steel and concrete and profit margins. But his real legacy, he realized, was going to be measured in full stomachs and paid rent and children who grew up believing the world was kind because someone had been kind to them. The Steel King was dead. Long live Leroy Padron, the man who'd been frozen for 3 decades and was finally, beautifully, impossibly alive. Outside, the sun continued to rise over the city, and it felt warmer than it had in years. Or maybe it was the same sun, and Leroy was just finally warm enough to feel it. Either way, he stood in his office on the 42nd floor, a crayon drawing pressed against his heart, and smiled. Because sometimes the most valuable thing a billionaire can give isn't money. It's the reminder that everyone, from janitors to CEOs, from hungry children to frozen kings, deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be treated with the dignity that comes from simply being human. And that was a foundation worth building on.